Welcome back, friends. Tonight we're venturing into the unknown, where every path seems to twist in unexpected ways and every shadow has a story. If you're ready to lose yourself in the darkness, make sure to like, subscribe, and let's take that final step together into the unknown. The Red Garden. When I took the job as groundskeeper at the McKinley Estate in Charleston, South Carolina, I thought it would be a quiet gig. The mansion was over a century old, an elegant relic hidden behind wrought iron gates and towering oak trees draped in Spanish moss. My main task was to tend to the gardens, especially the rose bushes that the McKinley family had been cultivating for generations. But there was one area of the estate that gave me chills: the Red Garden. It sat at the farthest edge of the property, surrounded by a rusted fence. The roses there bloomed blood red, brighter than any I'd ever seen, as though they were stained with something more than soil and water. Local lore said the Red Garden was cursed, that the roses grew over the graves of people who'd vanished long ago. The family never mentioned it, and my instructions were clear: stay away from the Red Garden. Of course, I was curious. Every day as I worked, I felt the pull of those roses, an almost magnetic urge to go beyond the rusted fence and explore. I tried to resist, but one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself walking toward it. The garden was eerily silent, not a single bird or insect disturbing the stillness. I approached the gate, its metal cold under my hand, and pushed it open. The roses seemed to glow in the dim light, their petals impossibly vibrant, like they were watching me. I knelt to examine them more closely and noticed something odd. The soil was darker here, almost black, and the smell, it was different. It wasn't the usual earthy scent of a garden. It was metallic, like iron. My stomach twisted, but I couldn't pull myself away. That's when I saw it, a small, faded locket nestled in the dirt beside one of the bushes. I picked it up, brushing the soil from its surface, and opened it to find a photograph of a young woman inside. Her expression was haunting, her eyes wide, like she was afraid of something. The next day, I decided to ask around about the estate's history. Most people were reluctant to talk, but eventually, I found an older man at a local diner who remembered the McKinleys. He told me about a series of disappearances in the area decades ago, stories of people who'd vanished near the estate. When I mentioned the Red Garden, he shuddered. "They say those roses are fed by something unnatural," he whispered, leaning closer. "The McKinleys were protective of that land, never let anyone near it." Back at the estate, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I worked in silence, glancing over my shoulder now and then, half expecting to see someone lurking by the garden. The locket weighed heavily in my pocket, its presence a constant reminder of that woman's haunted expression. Over the next few nights, I started having strange dreams. I'd find myself standing in the Red Garden, the roses blooming all around me, the air thick with that metallic scent. In the dreams, the woman from the locket would appear, her face pale and drawn, her eyes pleading. She'd reach out to me, whispering words I couldn't understand, her voice filled with a desperation that made my skin crawl. One night I woke up to find dirt under my fingernails, as though I'd been digging in my sleep. The sheets were stained with dark soil, and the smell of iron lingered in the air. My heart pounded as I tried to remember the dream, but it was a blur of red roses and shadowed figures. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I returned to the garden the next evening, locket in hand. I searched the ground near the rose bushes, digging carefully, hoping to find something that would explain the strange dreams. My fingers brushed against something solid, and I pulled it from the dirt. A small tarnished bracelet. It looked old, its links thin and delicate, and I realized with a shiver that it matched the locket perfectly. As I held it, a cold breeze swept through the garden, rustling the roses. I turned, half expecting to see the woman from my dream standing behind me, but the garden was empty. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as though the ground itself were holding its breath. The next morning, I went to the local archives, digging through old newspaper clippings about the disappearances. I found an article from 1932 about a young woman named Margaret, a housemaid who'd worked for the McKinleys. She'd vanished without a trace, and her family had searched for years, but no one ever found her. I looked at the locket and bracelet again, feeling a sinking dread. The woman in the photograph was Margaret. Her eyes, her expression, it was all too familiar, matching the face that had haunted my dreams. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but the dreams continued, each one more vivid than the last. In them, Margaret would lead me through the garden, her steps slow and deliberate, as though she were guiding me toward something. I'd follow, unable to resist, feeling the weight of the soil pressing down on me. Then, one night, the dream took a darker turn. Margaret led me to a spot near the center of the garden, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She knelt down, pressing her hand into the earth, and whispered, "Help me." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something, or someone, was trapped in that garden, and they wanted me to find them. The next day I returned to the garden with a shovel, my hands trembling. I dug carefully, each shovelful of earth feeling heavier than the last. Finally, my shovel hit something solid. I knelt, brushing the dirt away, and froze. It was a small wooden box, its surface rotted and cracked. Inside, I found a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. They were love letters, written in a delicate hand, each one signed by Margaret. The letters spoke of a forbidden romance with one of the McKinleys, a love kept secret due to the family's strict rules. But then, the letters took a darker turn. Margaret hinted at a terrible choice, a betrayal that had led to her disappearance. As I read, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, the roses swaying as though alive. The final letter ended abruptly, the ink smudged, as though she'd been interrupted. I felt a chill, realizing that Margaret hadn't just disappeared. She'd been buried, her secrets hidden beneath the roses. That night I couldn't sleep. The dreams continued, each one more vivid, until I felt like I was losing touch with reality. Margaret's face haunted me, her eyes pleading, her voice echoing in my mind. I knew I couldn't stay at the estate any longer. I left the McKinley estate the next morning, leaving the locket and bracelet on the groundskeeper's table with a note explaining everything I'd found. I never returned, and I never spoke about the Red Garden again. But sometimes late at night I catch a whiff of roses, sharp and metallic, and I know that Margaret's spirit is still there, waiting for someone else to uncover her story. And every time I think of that garden, I wonder how many other secrets lie buried beneath the soil, hidden among the roses, waiting for someone to find them. The Final Fortune. In Savannah, Georgia, where the air feels thick with history and shadows lurk around every corner, you come across all sorts of strange things. I was a detective with the local precinct, handling everything from petty theft to missing persons. But last year I got involved in a case that still keeps me up at night. It started with a call from a small, rundown psychic shop on the edge of town. The shop owner, a woman named Esther with too many scarves and a smoky gaze, had called to report a robbery. But it wasn't the usual break-in. She claimed someone had stolen her visions. When I arrived at the shop, I half expected a wild goose chase, but something about her look stopped me short. She invited me in, explaining that her visions, her gift, had been stolen. "Who stole it?" I asked, half smiling, expecting a tall tale. "A man," she whispered, her voice trembling. "A man with no face. He came to me in the middle of the night like a shadow, and he took my gift." I shook my head, scribbling notes on my notepad, hiding my disbelief. "Can you describe him?" She shook her head. "No, I told you. He had no face. But he left something." She led me to the back of the shop, pulling aside a dusty curtain to reveal a single tarot card lying face down on a wooden table. The back of the card was plain, worn, and when she turned it over, I felt a chill. The card showed the image of a figure cloaked in black, with empty eyes and a hand stretched out toward the viewer. It wasn't like any tarot card I'd ever seen. It looked more like something you'd find in a nightmare. Esther stared at it, her face pale. I know it sounds crazy, but people are going to start dying. I can see it, detective, and I can't stop it. I left that shop uneasy, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. That night, I dismissed her warning as a psychic's paranoia. But over the next few days, a series of strange deaths occurred around town. People were found dead in their homes, sitting at their dining tables or lying in bed, with expressions of pure horror frozen on their faces. The coroner couldn't determine a cause, calling them natural deaths, though nothing about them seemed natural. Then came the strangest part. Each time, a single tarot card would be found near the bodies. The same card I'd seen in Esther's shop, the faceless figure with the outstretched hand. The fourth victim, Mr. Sherman, was a retired professor. His wife found him in his study, a look of terror etched onto his face, with that cursed card lying on the desk beside him. I questioned her, asked if she'd seen anyone around, but she insisted they'd been alone all night. The more cases we uncovered, the more the city began to panic. Rumors spread about the death card and the faceless man who could take lives with a single touch. My own team began looking at me differently, like they expected answers I couldn't provide. I tried to focus, telling myself there was a rational explanation. But as the death toll grew, so did my obsession with the case. One night, exhausted and unable to sleep, I returned to Esther's shop. She greeted me with that same haunted look, as though she'd been waiting for me. "It's getting worse, isn't it?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded. People are scared. They think it's some kind of curse. She sighed, looking down. That card, it's a warning. The man who left it, he can see when death is coming. He's marking those he knows will die soon. "Who is he?" I demanded, my patience wearing thin. "He's a collector," she said, her eyes wide. "A soul collector. Once he knows someone's fate, he leaves his mark and no one can escape it." Frustrated, I tried to press her for more, but she had no answers. Only vague warnings and half-explained visions. I left her shop feeling as though I were carrying a weight I couldn't shake. That night, I returned home and found a single tarot card slipped under my door. I froze, my heart pounding as I stared at it, the faceless figure reaching out as though it were reaching for me. The fear gripped me, a sense of dread so intense I couldn't breathe. The next morning, I searched every inch of my house for signs of an intruder, but there was nothing. I brought the card to Esther, hoping for answers, but when I arrived at her shop, I found her lying on the floor, her eyes wide open, staring into nothing. And there, next to her, was the same card, its figure watching me with those empty, soulless eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was next, that the faceless man had marked me, and it was only a matter of time. I spent the next few days in a state of constant paranoia, jumping at shadows, unable to sleep, feeling like death was stalking me. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt a presence beside me. I opened my eyes to see a figure standing at the foot of my bed, cloaked in shadow, its face a blank void, its hand reaching out. "You can't escape your fate," it whispered, its voice like a distant echo. I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The room was empty, but the card lay on my nightstand, the figure's outstretched hand seeming to reach for me. Desperate, I sought out a priest, begging him to bless my home, to do anything that might lift the curse. But nothing worked. The dreams continued, the faceless man appearing every night, coming closer and closer until I could feel his cold breath on my skin. In a last attempt to break the curse, I burned the card, watching as the flames consumed the faceless figure. But that night I woke to find a new card lying beside me, untouched, the figure whole and intact, its hand closer than ever. Now I sit here, waiting, knowing my time is near. I can feel him in the room, watching, waiting to take me. And as I stare at that card, I understand that fate cannot be changed, that once the faceless man marks you, there is no escape. They'll find me in the morning with this card beside me, just like the others, and the faceless man will move on, leaving his mark on someone else, collecting souls, one by one. The Silent Trail. In the summer of 2019, I agreed to a hiking trip with my girlfriend, Emily, and her two friends, Jake and Sam. We'd been talking about exploring the Black Ridge Trail for months. It was a remote, nearly forgotten route deep in the Appalachian Mountains, supposedly closed off after part of it had washed away years ago. But people who'd hiked it recently said it was still accessible, and the view from the top was legendary. I wasn't the biggest hiker, but I wanted to impress Emily, and besides, what could go wrong? We planned to hike 2 days in, camp overnight near the peak, then return the next day. The four of us were excited. It sounded like a perfect mini-adventure. We set off early on a Friday morning, packs full and spirits high. The forest was thick, the trail narrow and winding, but we were prepared. The first day was exactly what I had expected. Beautiful views, lots of laughs, and Emily snapping pictures of everything. Jake and Sam, who were more experienced hikers, led the way, navigating us deeper into the wilderness with their GPS. That night, we set up camp in a small clearing off the trail. We cooked dinner, watched the stars, and went to bed. Everything seemed perfect, but the next morning things started feeling off. We woke up to a strange stillness. No birds, no wind, not even the usual rustling of leaves. Just complete silence. It was eerie, but I tried to brush it off. We packed up camp and started hiking again. But after about an hour, Jake, who was in front, stopped abruptly. "There's something wrong," he muttered, looking down at the trail. I followed his gaze. The ground in front of us was covered in fresh dirt, as if the path had been disturbed. But that wasn't what bothered me. There were no footprints, no signs of animals, no scuff marks from hikers. It was just a smooth, freshly turned patch of earth stretching about 50 feet ahead of us. "That's weird," Emily said, frowning. "Maybe a mudslide?" Jake shook his head. "There hasn't been any rain. And it's not just the dirt. Look at the trees." I looked up and felt a chill creep down my spine. The trees ahead of us were different. The thick, towering trunks we'd seen all morning were replaced by thin, twisted trees with dark, almost black bark. They looked sickly, as if they had been starved of sunlight for years. "We should go back," I said, the unease growing in my gut. But Jake shook his head again. "We're not turning back. We've come this far. It's probably just some kind of old burn scar." Reluctantly, we kept moving, but the deeper we went into the twisted forest, the worse the feeling got. The silence was suffocating, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. No animals, no birds, nothing. After another hour, Sam, who had been trailing behind, called out, "Hey, guys, wait up!" We stopped and turned. Sam looked pale, his face slick with sweat. "I think we passed this spot already." "What?" Jake frowned. "We've been going straight the whole time." "No, seriously," Sam insisted, his voice shaky. "I swear I saw that same tree half an hour ago." We all looked around, but everything looked the same. Those twisted trees, the smooth, disturbed dirt, the heavy silence. My heart started racing. Could we be lost? "We're not lost," Jake snapped, trying to sound confident but clearly shaken. "Let's just keep going. The peak should be close." But we weren't close. And we weren't alone. Another hour passed, and the tension between us was thick. Emily kept looking over her shoulder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The silence had gone from eerie to oppressive. Every step felt heavier, and the further we walked, the more disoriented I felt. Then we heard it. A low, faint whisper, like the wind through the trees, but wrong. It was too soft to make out, but it sent chills down my spine. We all stopped, frozen. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, grabbing my arm. Before I could answer, the whisper came again, louder this time, and closer. "Let's go back," Sam said, his voice trembling. "Seriously, something's not right." Even Jake, who had been so stubborn earlier, was looking panicked now. "Yeah, maybe we should." The ground beneath us shifted suddenly, like something had moved just beneath the surface. We all jumped back, staring at the disturbed earth. For the first time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were faint impressions in the dirt, like footprints, but wrong. They were too long, too narrow, and there were too many toes. Whatever had made them was massive, and it had passed through recently. "We need to go, now," I said, my voice shaking. Without waiting for a response, I turned and started walking back the way we'd come. The others quickly followed, and for the first time in hours, we moved in total silence. The whispering continued, faint and distant at first, but growing louder as we retraced our steps. The problem was the forest didn't look the same anymore. Every tree, every rock, every twisted branch looked identical. The trail we had been following was gone, replaced by more of that smooth, freshly turned dirt. We were completely disoriented. And the whispers, they weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, soft, urgent voices, coming from the trees, from the ground, from everywhere. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the more I heard them, the more panicked I became. Suddenly, Jake stopped dead in his tracks. "Do you see that?" We all looked ahead. There, just off the path, was a figure. It was standing among the trees, barely visible in the shadowy light. At first I thought it was another hiker, but something was wrong. The figure was too still, too tall. Its limbs were elongated, almost like they had been stretched. And then it moved. The figure stepped toward us, slow and deliberate, its long, twisted limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. It wasn't human. Whatever it wasn't human. "Run!" Jake shouted. We bolted, sprinting through the forest as fast as we could, crashing through branches and ducking under low-hanging limbs. The voices were louder now, deafening, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know how long we ran. Minutes? Hours? Time had become meaningless in the maze of trees. But eventually the trees thinned, and we stumbled into a clearing. The moment we stepped into the open, the voices stopped. The forest behind us was silent again. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, drenched in sweat, lungs burning. We didn't speak as we threw our packs in the trunk and peeled out of the trailhead, leaving the Black Ridge Trail and whatever was in those woods far behind us. We never found out what we saw that day, and we never went back. Joining us on this chilling journey through the unexplained. If you're still here, it means you survived, this time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments, what's the scariest place you've ever been? Until next time, stay curious and stay cautious.